Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the group corner. I'm Nelson Culp with Cornerstone, and Michelle Scott with OneAmerica will be joining us as well. This is Apples to Apples LTD. Just a few housekeeping items so you know. During this 1-hour CE class, there will be 2 questions that will be given out at various times. Just so you know, it's okay if you don't get the answers correct, more or less, to prove that you're still here on the broadcast so you can get the full credits for the CE class. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please type it into the question box and we will answer the question at the end of the presentation. Again, I'm Nelson Culp with Cornerstone. You have some of my information up on the slide on how to contact us. If there's additional questions, you can see a contact a Cornerstone representative for your answers and licensing. We have Sandy Weber, commissions, Joyce Feinauer, and in quoting, we have Jeff Baglin. And their information is below as well as out on our website. Another offer that Cornerstone does provide for our brokers is a succession plan. So don't leave your legacy to chance. Prepare your succession plan with Cornerstone. In the event of an untimely death or disability, what would happen to your loved ones and family? Is there a way to continue so they can have a financial stream of money? Find out more information on the Cornerstone website or contact your local Cornerstone representative for more details. One last thing, don't forget about Cornerstone's 2021 incentive program. The top qualifier will receive $5,000, plus one lucky qualifier will win a weekend getaway. Second place will receive $2,500, third place $2,000, and fourth place $1,500. Plus, there will be 10 $1,000 winners and 6 $500 winners. You must register to be eligible for this contest. There's more information out at the Cornerstone website, or again, please contact your local Cornerstone representative. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Michelle Scott with OneAmerica. And Michelle, go ahead and take it away.
Sure thing, Nelson.
Thanks.
All right, are you all seeing my screen, I hope? Nelson, can you answer?
I can see your screen.
Okay, good. Just making sure I got the switch over. So good morning, everyone. As Nelson said, I'm Michelle Scott. I'm with OneAmerica. OneAmerica is headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana. We are A+ rated, and we've been in business since 1877. I personally have been with OneAmerica. This is my 30th year, and that's 30. I age myself by saying that, but it's important to know, I feel, just because that tells you my background in this marketplace. As we go through the presentation today, certainly, if there are questions, please type those in. We'll try to get answers to you during the presentation. If not, we can absolutely get back to you following the presentation. And also, as Nelson mentioned, there will be 2 polling questions. I'm going to do a polling question between slides 16 and 17 and between slides 26 and 27. It does not matter if you answer those questions correctly. It's just a matter of being able to answer those questions that shows that you were here in attendance. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're going to look at comparing apples to apples with long-term disability proposals. For most of you that have worked in the disability marketplace, let's see here, there we go. You know, long-term disability contracts can be confusing. They're arguably one of the most confusing products in the marketplace, and they can be very complex as well. There are lots of moving parts in a long-term disability contract. The other thing about long-term disability contracts is you're not typically, as brokers, dealing with them on a daily basis, unlike your medical or your dental that have frequent ongoing claims. You've got things that you're working regularly with in those medical marketplace. Disability is a product where you hope to not ever have to use it, but it's certainly important and it needs to be there. So people feel less comfortable, I believe, with long-term disability because of that. So in an apples to apples comparison, they can be difficult because the contracts vary greatly from carrier to carrier. They, not only that, carriers have different names for the same benefit provisions, and we'll go through a few of those items. So again, my goal here today is just to try to help you make sure you're comparing things that are similar. The dilemma facing agencies, brokerage agencies today, evaluating long-term disability contracts can be a challenge. It's not the highest revenue producing product, although again, an extremely important product. And the time that's needed to spend with your clients on other things such as the medical, the dental, the ACA, the COBRA, the leave, medical leave challenges, all of that spreads your time very thin. So again, becoming experts in everything can be challenging. So to take those deep dives that are necessary in long-term disability can be a challenge. I would suggest to you, in most cases, to look to your carrier partners to help you with those deep dives. So those ancillary carriers that do sell the long-term disability coverage, they should be willing to help you evaluate contract to contract to make sure you're setting up a plan that's similar, especially if you're moving plan designs from one plan to another. All right. So the next thing, we're going to set up a template that you can use when you're sending out an RFP to make sure your language is similar. A typical RFP should include the following: the elimination period, sometimes also called a waiting period. So that is the number of days employees have to wait before disability plans kick in. So again, elimination period is the most common term. Sometimes you'll hear the term waiting period, and that's, people will say that because waiting period until the benefits kick in, but waiting period generally refers to the period of time that an employee has to be employed at an employer's place of business to become benefit eligible. So a lot of times a waiting period would be, the date you're hired, you become eligible for benefits, or first of the month following date of hire, you become eligible for benefits. That's a waiting period. Generally, we refer to the elimination period, which is the length of time you have to be disabled before benefits kick in. The benefit percentage is also important when you're comparing your disability plan design. So whether you're doing a 50%, a 60%, 66 2/3, that's something that certainly needs to be evaluated. The benefit maximum, how much is going to be paid out? What is the policy maximum on a monthly basis to the claimant that becomes disabled? Your own occupation definition, and the majority of group disability plans, just so you know, is a 2-year own occupation definition. So for the first 2 years, if you're disabled from your specific duties of your occupation, you're generally considered disabled from your occupation. Then after 2 years, most group carriers are going to say anything that you could be reasonably suited based on your training, education, and experience. If they can get you back into some sort of profession based on that criteria, then you would probably fall out of the disability plan in the any occupation period. So the own occupation for the good majority of group contracts is going to be that 2-year ONOC. You're going to see lots of variations though. You have 3-year ONOCs, 5-year ONOCs. You have ONOCs to the full Social Security normal retirement age. So those are other things that will be taken into consideration. The contribution levels of the disability plan, whether the employer is paying all of it, whether the employee is paying a portion of it, or whether it's full voluntary, the employees be paying the whole cost of that. So voluntary, you'll often see voluntary as a terminology, you'll see worksite as a terminology. Those are generally programs where the employees are going to pay the entire cost. So you're going to need a census in order to rate your groups for disability coverage. And the census generally needs to include your income or the employee's income, their date of birth, their occupation, and the gender. That gives you the most accurate picture of the demographics for the group. There are certainly programs out there that are shelf rated in different scenarios depending on what you're looking at. Those can be valuable as well in certain situations. But for most of the time, you're going to see that the census information is needed to put together a long-term disability quote. If there's any current coverage in force, Certainly providing rate information as well as the current certificate of coverage would be extremely valuable during the RFP. Most of the time, we see RFPs that say, hey, I want a 60% to 6,000, 180-day EP to Social Security normal retirement age. And we absolutely can quote based on that. But with a long-term disability contract and the complexities therein, those rates could vary widely depending what else is included in those contracts or excluded in those contracts. So one would think that the information provided in the RFP would be similar based on carriers, but don't assume that. Don't assume that they're matching contract to contract. Unless you provide a certificate of coverage and indicate it needs to match the current plan of benefits, again, there's so many different provisions within those contracts that vary that don't assume it's a matching contract. Rates can vary by as much as 20% or more, depending what type of provisions are in the proposals. Those can include cost containment provisions, such as mandatory rehab provision, or self-reported limitations, or mental, nervous, drug, and alcohol limits that are longer than you typically see. There are lots of ways for carriers to change the rate in a long-term disability program with those underlying provisions within the contract. We'll look at some of those additional LTD items that you should be considering during the RFP. So trial work days. Trial work days in long-term disability can be called a number of other things as well. You can see it called temporary recovery days, accumulation of the elimination period, but trial work days or accumulation periods are generally what you see most frequently. So this is when the carrier encourages disabled employees to return to work during the elimination period if they are able to do so. And that is really important because if your LTD contract doesn't have a provision that allows for that, it takes away the incentive for an employee to attempt to return to work. So let's say, for example, if you've got somebody that's got a 90-day elimination period and they're 45 days into the 90-day elimination period, and if they're starting to feel better, but if their EP, their elimination period would have to start all over again if they try to return to work and it's not successful, they're not going to make that attempt to return to work. So having that trial work days or temporary recovery days or accumulation is important to encourage those employees to return to work if possible. The contract's usually going to state the number of days the elimination period can be, the employee can return before having to start the elimination period over again. So the number of trial work days plus the elimination equals the accumulated period. So most contracts will offer the same number of trial work days as the number of elimination period days. So for example, if you have an LTD contract that has a 90-day elimination period, then generally if an employee attempts to return to work 90 days or less during the elimination period, then they're not going to be penalized. And by that I mean that day that they return to work is not going to count towards satisfying their elimination period, but they're not going to have to start their elimination period clock all over again. So again, in that example I said before, if it's 90 days as their elimination period, they're 45 days into their elimination period, and let's say on day 46 they attempt to return to work, but just can't do it. So it's not successful, and on day 47 they're back out of work again. That's an attempt to return to work, but they don't have to start over again. They don't have to start their elimination period over again. Some contracts will put strict limits on those days. I've seen contracts that have 15 days or 30 days, which is a pretty limited number of days because that can be difficult for partially disabled employees to qualify for claim. So the more liberal that time period is, the better for the employees as far as attempting to return to work and maybe even coming into a partial disability scenario and getting back into an active status mode for work. So the RFP alert this is a very important component to an LTD policy. Be sure that you require your carrier partners to quote the proper number of trial work days. You can ask that the accumulation period equals a minimum of 2 times the elimination period. So for example, carriers will do, if the elimination period is 90 days, you can have up to 180 days to attempt to return to work to satisfy that elimination period. Work incentive, return to work. Again, this is different terminology. Some carriers call it a return to work incentive. Some carriers call it just a work incentive benefit. This is when an employee is working part-time and possibly earning up to a full-time benefit. So, for example, the work incentive or return to work is once somebody is already on claim and then attempts to return to work after they're already on claim. What we talked about, the accumulation of the elimination period, was somebody that was in the elimination period, not yet on claim. The work incentive is once somebody's already on claim and then attempts to return to work. This provision allows LTD claimants, how LTD claim payments are handled when a partially disabled employee works part-time after having satisfied the elimination period. So imagine if an employee was totally disabled due to back surgery and was collecting an LTD benefit. Later, he or she recuperates and begins to work part-time. The LTD benefit then becomes reduced because obviously now they're back to work part-time, they're earning a part-time earning. The reduction in the LTD benefit can motivate the employee to stay home rather than to work. So the work incentive corrects this disincentive so the employee can earn up to their pre-disability income between their part-time pay and their LTD benefit. Simply stated, an employee can work part-time and still get up to full-time pay. So in simplistic terms, you can say, hey, 100% of what I was making before, if I work 50% of the time, because I can only go back half days, and then I get LTD the other 50% of the time, I'm making my full 100% income that I was making before I became disabled. Return to work timeframes can certainly vary. That's one of the things we're going to look at here. Standard return to work timeframes in carrier contracts are 12 months. Their standard is 24 months. And then you see some provisions that allow for unlimited return to work. Some carriers even call this like progressive partial. If you've heard that terminology, progressive partial would be the same as an unlimited return to work. So once the combined income reaches 100% of pre-disability income, the LTD benefit is reduced. So we're not going to allow somebody to earn their disability benefit plus their partial disability earnings and exceed what they were making before they became disabled. But you can do it up to 100% of your income. So if you take your partial disability earnings plus your LTD benefit, and it equates to, let's say, 110% of your previous income, we're then going to reduce that LTD benefit by that 10% so that your partial earnings and your disability benefit don't exceed your pre-disability income. Most contracts include the work incentive. The question is, how long does it last? Again, 12 months is probably the most common. And if you don't request otherwise, most of the contracts you see out there will have probably a 12-month return to work. Some contracts do allow that 24-month return to work incentive, and others will do that full duration or unlimited. So all the way up to Social Security normal retirement age, or what they also call unlimited return to work. The RFP alert here then should be sure that you request your carriers to quote a minimum number of months, typically at least 12 months is what I would suggest. Benefit durations. Benefit durations can be confusing because you see lots of terminologies out there. SSNRA, which is Social Security normal retirement age, SSFRA, Social Security full retirement age. Those are probably the most common terminologies, and those are contracts that will pay up until your Social Security retirement age. And as most of you probably know, Social Security has a graded scale for retirement age. So it might be 67 or 66 and a half or 67 and a half is your retirement age. Some older contracts out there may have a benefit duration that is payable to age 65. If you have a contract out there that has that provision, you really should, I would strongly encourage you to try to replace that contract with a benefit payable to Social Security normal retirement age. Because what would happen is if you have an older contract in one of your accounts that only pays to 65, and if somebody's Social Security retirement age isn't until 67, there's going to be a 2-year gap in income from the time their LTD benefit would stop until the Social Security would kick in. So again, most carriers that have written anything probably in the last 15 to 20 years, it's going to be that Social Security normal retirement age. But if you've got a contract, an old policy that's been around for quite a long time, check out the language, see if it says payable to age 65, because if it does, you should consider updating that benefit. There are other benefit durations available as well, items such as you can see a 2-year benefit duration, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. That essentially means that if somebody became disabled, the benefit would be payable for that period of time. So for example, if you have a 5-year benefit duration on an account, and if an employee is 30 years old and they become totally and permanently disabled for the rest of their working years, if you have a 5-year benefit duration, that 30-year-old employee will only have 5 years of benefit under that LTD contract. Now, there's lots of schools of thought about what can be better for a group or not. I do see in many scenarios where you class out benefits. So maybe for salaried or management employees, they provide a benefit all the way to Social Security normal retirement age. And maybe for hourly employees, they provide a 5-year benefit duration. So that is a fairly common marketplace trend. Another thing is, I know some brokers consider 5 years as a cost savings measure to an employer. And that the hope would be that if somebody is disabled at least 5 years, then by that point, Social Security disability would kick in, so they would have something. Generally, it does take quite a while for Social Security disability to get approved. I would say, it's pretty common. I think the statistic is something like 70% of all claimants who initially apply for Social Security disability get declined. Now you can go through those appeals processes and those numbers become better, but it can take a number of years for that to happen. So the hope would be that if you purchase at least a 5-year duration benefit, that by that point, if somebody is seriously disabled, the disability, the Social Security disability would kick in. So the benefit duration continued is nearly every contract has language to address some employees that become disabled over the age of 60. Sometimes it's referred to the ADEA Act, reducing benefit duration. That is essentially just a graded scale for employees that are over the age of 60. So even, for example, if you have a group disability contract on somebody, and let's say you have an active employee that's 70 years old, that graded scale is still going to allow that employee to probably get at least 12 months worth of benefit under a group LTD contract. So your RFP alert here is, it's a good idea to stipulate the benefit duration that you'd like to see on every plan to ensure that you're getting a consistent proposal. Typically, you're going to want to request that SSNRA or SSFRA, but again, for cost saving measures, you might want to look at a 5-year duration if that's something that your employer might be interested in. You can always show them the option as well, show them an SSFRA or SSNRA option, and then show them a cost difference for a 5-year option. And it just, gives them more variation to consider during the proposal process. All right, minimum benefit within contracts. Minimum benefits can vary greatly. One of the most common is probably is $100, so a flat $100. So what this means is it comes into play when employees receiving an additional benefit outside of just the LTD benefit. So for example, that could be workers' compensation, that can be Social Security disability. So if For example, somebody is qualified for long-term disability. Let's just say they qualify for a $2,000 a month benefit. If Social Security if workers' comp ends up paying them $2,000 a month, then obviously the minimum benefit in that scenario would kick in because there's not lost income there. So in that scenario, if you had the minimum benefit as $100, that $100 is what would be paid. Other carriers can quote a flat $50, or one of the most common that we use is generally going to be the $100 or 10% of the normal benefit. So in the example I just used, where somebody's earning $2,000 or their benefit's $2,000, if workers' comp pays them $2,000, then the minimum benefit would be the greater of 10% or $100. So in that scenario, it would be $200 instead of the $100. Again, RFP alert, it's a good idea to let somebody know if you want something other than whatever their standard issue minimum benefit would be. All right, 24-hour coverage. I don't know if you guys have heard that terminology or not. Long-term disability is 24-hour coverage. That means it covers whether it's a work-related disability or a non-work-related disability. Short-term disability is always just non-occupational. So it's only going to cover in the event of a non-occupational disability, because under short-term disability, an employer group would have workers' comp to cover those short-term disability scenarios. But long-term disability is going to cover for both work and non-work related. So most carriers do quote as 24-hour coverage, and any income earned from workers' comp would be reduced, would reduce the LTD benefit. If the employee receives more from workers' comp than would normally be paid under the LTD policy, the minimum benefit would apply, just as we talked about there. Most states, the workers' comp programs have more restrictive benefits than a typical LTD contract. So if the contract doesn't have 24-hour coverage, the amount the employee can collect will be less. So one thing I have seen, and it's been on rare occasion, but I have seen an LTD carrier quote a non-occupational LTD coverage. So it's important to note, because obviously there's going to be a significant difference of cost if somebody quotes a non-occupational LTD benefit compared to the standard 24-hour coverage. Again, most all carriers are going to quote it as 24-hour coverage unless otherwise requested. But again, just make sure you note that in your proposal in case anybody does quote that non-occupational disability plan. Okay, pre-existing conditions. Pre-existing conditions in group long-term disability are medical conditions that employee has before becoming covered under the LTD plan. Disabilities that arise from a pre-X condition are excluded in most LTD contracts. The most common pre-X that you see in group LTD plans is a 312 pre-X, and how that works is anything for which the employee was treated 3 months prior to the effective date would not be covered if they become disabled for that particular condition within the first 12 months. And I always like to give a few examples of this when we're talking about pre-existing. So let's say an employer puts a brand new plan in place on July 1st, and on July 2nd, they had an employee that got in an automobile accident and broke their back and had to have surgery and was going to be out of work for quite some time. That obviously is not a pre-existing condition because they put the plan in place on July 1st. On July 2nd, this happened. So this accident was not something they were previously treated for. They hadn't seen a doctor for. So that's not a pre-existing condition. Another scenario for pre-existing. Let's say 3 years ago, an employee was treated for a knee injury. They had surgery on that knee, corrected, everything was good, no further treatment. They were not treated in the 3 months prior to the effective date. And 6 months into their LTD plan, they blew out that knee again and had to have new corrective surgery. That, again, would not be pre-existing because the fact that the treatment was old 3 years ago, and they were not treated in those 3 months prior to the effective date for that condition. So even though that condition was in their previous medical history, it wasn't in that time frame just before the LTD plan started. Now, the third scenario I like to always talk about is somebody that is being treated continuously for something. So an example for that might be an insulin-dependent diabetic. Because they're taking insulin on a daily basis, they might be on an insulin pump. They're obviously being treated. So treated is seeing a doctor, taking medication for a condition. Anything that would be related for that insulin-dependent diabetic would not be covered in the first 12 months of a plan. However, the good news about group disability plans is at the end of that pre-existing time frame, even those conditions become covered. So if an employee does have a pre-existing condition, once your 312 limit runs out, so once that 12-month time period runs out, even those pre-existing conditions become covered. So that's a good difference in group plans versus individual plans, because individual plans are often going to rider out a specific medical condition, where group plans, we have what we call like a get better date. Like at the end of that 12-month time frame, even those pre-existing conditions can become covered. Some carriers are going to have more restrictive provisions in LTD. You might see a 624. So that's a 6-month look back. Anything treated would not be covered for the first 24 months. You then also have what's called a treatment-free period in some pre-existing plans. So you might see a 3312, a 3612, lots of different variations out there. So the way an example with a treatment-free period is, with the 3312, if a claim is incurred within the first 12 months of coverage and the employee received treatment in the 3 months prior to the effective date, no benefits would be payable unless that employee was able to go three months where they went treatment-free of that condition. So if they were treated for something in the 3 months prior to the effective date, but let's say for the first 6 months of the LTD coverage, they were not treated and then they became disabled, then they obviously met that 3-month treatment-free provision, and that condition would not be excluded. Voluntary plans are typically going to have longer pre-ex periods, and that's because there is some anti-selection when you're talking about voluntary plans. Generally in voluntary plans, carriers assume 25% participation, which means 1 out of every 4 employees would elect the coverage. So with that thought in mind, you typically know that folks that maybe have poorer health or medical conditions would more likely elect the coverage than those that don't. So because of that, you're going to see more restrictive pre-ex periods like a 1212 or 1224. So a 12-month look back, not covered for the first 12 months, or a 12-month look back, not covered for the first 24 months. One other thing I will say about pre-existing as well is if you are replacing a prior plan, so if you switch carriers, let's say you have a plan in place with XYZ company and you switch that to ABC carrier, there is what's generally called continuity of coverage, meaning it's a type of no loss, no gain. So if your employees under the prior carrier had already met their pre-existing limitation provisions under the prior carrier, simply by making a change in carriers, they don't have to satisfy a new pre-existing time period. Okay, and some carriers will include what's called a prudent person language, and this can get really tricky. It can be hard to prove, so it's one of those things that I don't typically recommend, but we do have the option of including it. Basically, what prudent person language says is that even if somebody didn't get treated in a time period before the contract was put into place, but if they should have reasonably sought medical treatment, then if a prudent person would have sought medical treatment, then it could be excluded. Again, that can be very difficult to prove because they'd have to find out that somebody did not, a carrier would have to find out that somebody did not seek medical treatment. So for example, if somebody was having chest pains for 3 weeks before a disability contract took effect, but they never went to see a doctor over these chest pains. If a carrier could determine that was an employee didn't go see the doctor, then the prudent person could make that a pre-ex. Again, it's very subjective and it's hard to prove. So typically I would not recommend putting that contract language in there, but there are options for that. Okay, so this is going to be our first poll. So if everybody out there's listening, poll must be closed to enable. Poll must be closed to enable screen sharing. All right, you guys are seeing, you're not seeing the poll. Oh yeah, you are. Okay, so the question being, in group contracts, so let's talk about group contracts here. Is a medical condition that was treated 3 years ago considered pre-existing? Yes or no? And I do see lots of responses there. And the majority of you have gotten that correctly. I'm going to just give it a second to make sure everybody has responded. Looks like we have a few that didn't respond yet, just to make sure. If you haven't responded, go ahead and get your vote in. The answer on this one is under group contracts. A medical condition that was treated 3 years ago is generally not going to be considered pre-existing as long as it was not treated in those 3 months prior to the effective date. So the answer here, the correct answer would be no. All right. All right, impact on participation and the assumption on rates. So when requesting an RFP for employer paid benefits, the carrier is going to assume that all employees will receive coverage, because when you request an employer paid disability plan, the assumption is that all of the eligible employees are going to be covered under the plan. So if it's an employer paid and the employer pays 100% of that, we're going to have 100% of the employees covered. If a plan is what we call contributory, where that is where an employer pays a portion of the cost and the employees pay a portion of the cost, generally carriers are going to request 75% participation in those plans. So the cost share can be variable, just so you know. An employer could pay 50%, an employee pay 50%, or an employer could pay 75% of the cost and the employee pay 25% of the cost. Whatever that contribution share is, it doesn't really matter, but most carriers would want at least 75% of the eligible employees to participate. And under voluntary plans, it typically assumes a 25% participation in the plan. So with that in mind, what you want to think about is the higher the participation, generally the lower your rate. So when there's an employer paid plan that the employer's paying for the entire cost and there's 100% participation, that's going to be your lowest rate for a disability plan. If you quote that identical plan under a voluntary basis, that's going to be your highest rate. Because again, there's that anti-selection where you assume only 1 out of every 4 are going to participate in the plan. So those that are less healthy or might have medical conditions would be more likely to participate. There are many variables to consider when you're including carriers' enrollment capabilities if you're doing voluntary plans. The enrollment strategy at the group, whether or not the meetings will take place, what other products will be offered, medical coverage costs, and then the income levels of employees. One other wrench that has gotten thrown into the mix for us recently, as everyone's well aware, is COVID. Enrollments have taken on a whole different look now with COVID, because you're not seeing large groups of people come together doing face-to-face meetings for benefits. So we're seeing a lot more Zoom calls, webinar calls, things like this as far as enrollment meetings. We can do, and carriers put together video presentations. So if you have a group that wants to do a voluntary plan, there are carriers that can develop video presentations of the product specific to that company. the Zoom calls, or generally you can provide printed materials only, but be a little weary of that, because generally just distributing printed materials will hurt participation in voluntary programs, because employees don't necessarily always understand disability programs, and without having somebody there to answer questions, it can hurt your participation in those plans. So for your RFP alert, in order to get a good apples to apples rate scenario, it's generally a good idea to dictate to the carrier what you'd like them to use as the participation requirement, whether you want it to be a voluntary plan or a contributory plan or a true employer paid plan. And in some scenarios, especially if it's a company that does not have current coverage in place, show them all those options. You could show them an employer paid plan and a voluntary plan. And I would say contributory plans are less common where there's a cost share, but certainly showing an employer paid plan and then a voluntary plan and let them make the decisions about that is always a great thing to do when you're taking a group out to bid. Okay, so final LTD RFP provisions. These are really all the things you want to consider when you're looking at an RFP for LTD. The elimination period, the benefit percentage. I'm not going to go down through all of these things because this is obviously all the things that we just talked about, all the benefit provisions, the participation requirements. So we'll move on from that one. Okay, some ideas for lowering rates. So many of the previous slides deal with how to prevent carriers from watering down their LTD contracts when you sell it to your client. And just so you know, that does happen a lot, where carriers will include those cost containment provisions. If you don't tell them otherwise, they will include those cost containment provisions just to get you your most competitive rates. Again, we're talking about mandatory rehab versus voluntary rehab. You're talking about self-reported limitations versus not having a limitation on those items. However, there are ways of reducing costs while still keeping the core contract strong. And in some cases, you can reduce the costs while improving the benefits. So we're going to talk a little bit now about benefit taxation for disability. So historically, the majority of employer-sponsored group plans are considered taxable by the IRS. And that's because the majority of group disability plans are paid by the employer and therefore are considered taxable benefits at claim time. However, in 2004, the IRS developed a ruling that says that the employer could pay for an LTD plan for employees, and to get a non-taxable benefit, the employees could elect to have the cost of that plan input into their W-2 at year end so that they pay tax on the premium. So if they become disabled, the benefit is non-taxable. So let me give an example of that, because I know that gets a little confusing. Let's say for Michelle Scott, my company pays for a long-term disability plan for me. Every month, the premium on my plan for my cost is $10 a month that they pay towards my disability plan. So at the end of the year, they've paid $120 in premium towards my long-term disability coverage. So if my employer were to take my W-2 at year end and just increase that number in my W-2, let's say my income was $30,000, and at the end of the year, they put in my W-2 $30,120, I'm then paying tax on that $120 that they've put towards my long-term disability benefit, so that if I ever become disabled, that benefit would be non-taxable. And it's important to note that a non-taxable long-term disability plan is much more appealing, because generally most group plans are about a 60% benefit. So if you take a 60% benefit and then hit it with tax, you might be in the high 40% as far as like 47 or 48% or 50% replacement ratio. So that's going to be, substantially less than what somebody's used to getting had they been working. So you want to make sure in an RFP alert that you always request whether you want it to be employer paid. If you want a non-taxable benefit, you want to make sure you indicate that in your RFP, because there is a rate load for those non-taxable benefits. Generally, the rules for disability taxation are as follows. If the premium for the group LTD is being paid by the employer, the benefit is considered taxable. If the premiums are paid with after-tax dollars, for example, voluntary LTD, then the benefit is non-taxable. And one question that I often get, and it's really important that you don't do this, don't put your disability plans into a cafeteria plan. So don't pre-tax any disability premiums, because then that forces the benefit to be taxable. And one of the greatest advantages of a voluntary LTD plan is that the benefit is non-taxable at claim time. Or if the employer pays the premium and includes the premiums in their employee's taxable pay, then the benefits are non-taxable. That's just as I had indicated in my example. So a benefits taxation cheat sheet, for example, employee pays the premium with after-tax dollars, it's non-taxable. With pre-tax dollars, it's taxable. If the employer pays the premium and it's not included in their pay at year end, then it's taxable. If they've grossed up the employee's pay on their W-2, then it is a non-taxable benefit. The IRS has rules that owners of certain types of companies can receive non-taxable benefits. So if you have owners within a one of these types of corporations, corporation, partner, sole proprietor, or greater than 2% on an S Corp, partners, sole proprietors, and S Corp, they're generally non-taxable. So if you have a partnership, let's say you have a law firm that has 3 partners in it, those people should be put into their own class and be classified as a non-taxable LTD benefit, and then have all other employees in a class 2, and their benefit should be taxable. So using 2004-55 to lower rates. So the 2004-55, again, is that gross up concept where you gross up the W-2 at year end by the premiums paid. Generally, you can reduce the benefit percentage. So if you have a group disability plan in place, that's a 60% plan, you could reduce that plan to a 55% plan and do it on a gross up or 2004-55 basis. The employer is paying less in cost because they're paying for a 55% plan now instead of a 60% plan, but the benefits paid out at claim time would actually be higher, because that 55% payout at claim time, non-taxable, would be a higher benefit to the employees than a 60% plan that's taxed. So it gets even more dramatic when you're looking at something like maybe you have an employer that's got a 66 2/3 plan in place, and you can put them into a 60% plan, non-taxable. You can save the employer a significant amount of money by reducing the benefit percentage, and the employees ultimately are getting a higher benefit at claim time. All right, let's see here. I think that is where my next polling question is. So let's take this next polling question. All right. In group disability plans, are the benefits of an employer-paid disability plan taxed at claim time? So if you have an employer-paid plan that the employer is paying the entire cost, oops, excuse me, I didn't hit launch, that the employer is paying the entire cost of that disability plan, is it generally then going to be taxed at claim time? Yes or no? If the employer is paying the full cost of it, and let's say they're not grossing it up, they're not 2004-55, is it going to be taxed at claim time? Looks like most of you have answered. I'm going to give it a few more seconds just to make sure we get the majority of the votes in. And the correct answer on that is yes. If an employer pays for the cost of a group disability plan and they're not grossing up and they're not 2004-55, the plan, then it is going to be taxable at claim time. All right, so we're coming to the end here. All right, so in summary, by dictating to the carrier the type of provisions that you want during the RFP, you can make sure you're comparing apples to apples in those proposals that you are seeing. There may be times when carriers can't provide the provisions you've requested. And in that case, you want to make sure that you ask a carrier to note any exceptions to the RFP. Or have an open dialogue with your group about the types of things such as benefit taxation, contract limitations that will allow you to position yourself as a consultative advocate. The biggest thing I think that I feel does make you seem very knowledgeable about disability benefits when you talk with an employer is that taxation piece, is explaining to them how you can turn an employer paid disability plan into a non-taxable benefit. And if anybody needs assistance from me on that topic, want to get into more detail about gross up plans versus 2004-55 plans, I am happy to do that. The other thing to make sure you're doing apples to apples quotes is if you're replacing current coverage, is to look at those contracts at quote time. So if there's current coverage in place, certainly allowing whoever's marketing that program for you to have those current coverage booklets to make sure you are comparing apples to apples. So that is actually where I will end my presentation, and we have filled our required 50 minutes for a CE class in the state of Ohio. Thank you all for participating. If there are any questions, I don't know, Nelson, is there anything you want to add at the end of this?
No, but you did a great job. And Michelle, there are a couple of questions here.
Okay.
So if you'd like, I'll go ahead and read a couple of them and kind of let you answer them here.
Sure.
All right, let me just take a look at this. One of the questions we have, if there is a buy option, is the benefit taxable?
If there's a buy up, I'm assuming that's going to be a buy up option. So like if an employer pays for a core plan of benefits and then employees can increase that and buy up, that would be taxed on a prorated basis, meaning, so I'm going to give an example. If an employer provides 60% to $2,000 and then they allow employees to buy up to 60% to $5,000, the portion that the employer pays for would be taxable, and then the buy-up option would be non-taxable at claim time. So it would be prorated based on which piece is taxable and non-taxable.
Okay, great. Couple more questions here for you. Can you establish classes of employees and make one group benefit taxable and one group non-taxable, like the owners in a non-taxable class?
Absolutely. Long-term disability is a product that you can class out, and essentially you can discriminate. You can, as long as you can discriminate by class description, you absolutely can do that. So you can say salaried versus hourly, and give salaried people non-taxable and hourly people taxable. You can do classes of based on occupation. So you can say executives and management, and then all other employees. You can base it on years of service. So employees that have been employed 5 years or more, and then employees with less than 5 years of service. The key to that when you're creating those class descriptions is anybody that fits into that description must be in that class. So you cannot, just so you know, you cannot pick and choose people. So you can't say, I like Joe and Sue and Tom, so I want them to have a non-taxable benefit. You have to create it to where it's a classification, and anybody that meets that classification has to be in that group.
All right, fantastic. And then Michelle, let's probably come on yours. How will they get confirmation of the CEs that they receive?
Yeah, they'll get a CE certificate through the email, and we've collected email addresses with your registration, so you will get a CE certificate through an email.
Perfect, perfect. And then we've had this question come in multiple times, and this will be our last one that we have. But will there be a copy of the presentation sent out?
I absolutely can provide that to you guys if Cornerstone wants to distribute that.
Yep, and we can definitely do that. So.
Certainly.
Fantastic. Well, that concludes our broadcast today. Again, Michelle, thank you very much. Outstanding job. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and be on the lookout for those emails.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your attendance today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.